Hey family, it's Brother Marlon. How you doing? I hope you're enjoying your Monday. It is Motivational Monday, and I've got some great information and inspiration for you. I hope it blesses your day and blesses your life. Right now, I had the awesome opportunity to interview Dr. Chris Conti. He's Reverend Doctor. He's a pastor in the area. He pastors Emmanuel Baptist Church in Rankin, PA, and he and his wife are also physicians. And so he has an interesting perspective when it comes to church and when it comes to medicine. And so we asked the question earlier this week, and I'm so honored to have his perspective on this. What does he think about churches opening back up?
Well, I appreciate the invitation to be here and talk with you and your listeners. It is a unique space to be in, not just here in Pittsburgh, but there are probably only a handful of individuals in the country, men and women who are both pastors of their churches and physicians. And at our church, we are also blessed to have my wife, who hates the term First Lady, but we'll use that because it's a familiar ethnic church name that we give to the wife of the pastor. But she's also a family physician locally here practicing in McKeesport. So we have two physicians, both of whom are invested in the community, people of faith who have worked on the front lines since this COVID pandemic hit Pennsylvania. So we're talking, 13 weeks now. We've both taken care of patients who have tested positive. We've seen very sick people. We've seen people with very few symptoms. We've seen some people recover. We've seen some not recover. And so I think we do have a very unique and God-scripted perspective that we believe that God wants us to be able to share. So we are really appreciative. And I say we because even though my wife is working today, we have had the opportunity to have communication with a lot of people through all of this technology. And so we are excited about the opportunity to share all of those things. So, now that we are getting ready to enter into this new phase of what, the country calls the reopening of America, but here in Pennsylvania, just the reopening of our businesses and our social places of gathering. The church has kind of been in the middle from the very beginning. At first, churches were wide open and it was left up to pastors. I mean, we had, a statewide conference call with a representative from the Secretary of Health for the state. And they said, well, we'll leave it up to you guys. And this was, some 10, 12 weeks ago. We'll leave it up to the churches to decide. But then when it became clear just the magnitude and the scope of the problem, not just globally, but locally in Pennsylvania, that changed and churches kind of got lumped into all of these other organizations that were mandated to close. And that was appropriate because of the scope. And now that, recently our president has made some statements that I don't personally believe are faith-driven. I think they're politically driven, are trying to stir up his evangelical base to get on board with this whole concept of opening up America for financial reasons. Now many churches, again, find themselves kind of in the middle, perhaps even confused because the information that comes from the bully pulpit of the White House is, supposed to be considered valid and reliable, but we all know that that's not how it is. However, when people hear it and it conforms with what they desire, which is we want to go back to church and we want to gather, then people find themselves confused. Well, what should I believe? Should I believe what the president is telling me that churches need to open right away? Now we're going to green, and green's supposed to mean that it's all clear and it's safe to go back outside. But the reality is not quite so clear. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some of those things and hopefully encourage people to do what I've been encouraging from the very beginning, which is to make information-driven decisions and not purely emotion-driven decisions. Now, it's impossible to make an emotionless decision because we're emotional creatures. But in this case, sometimes our emotions can get us into situations that we could have avoided if we took advantage of the information. And, the Bible tells us in Proverbs chapter 8, it says, power and sound judgment are mine, which means that God gives us access to information to help drive our decision making. So, when I break down what that decision making looks like, it really comes down to what we know, what we don't know, and how that should drive what we do. And so, based on COVID-19, what we know, we've learned a lot about the virus in the last 2.5 months. We now know that it's not purely a respiratory virus. We know that it affects multiple organ systems, so the lung, the heart, the brain, the kidneys, the liver, the entire digestive system. We're finding out that it also involves the reproductive system. And so it's a multi-system virus, as are the other viruses in that coronavirus family. So this is not unique to coronavirus. But because initially so many people were getting sick because of the respiratory complaints, that became the focus. But the reality is we're seeing a lot of people who are having really bad heart problems, brain problems. We're seeing patients who've had strokes that have been attributed to COVID-19, heart attacks that have been attributed to COVID-19. And now perhaps people are hearing that, particularly in African Americans, we're seeing a higher rate of blood clots in the lung, or what we call pulmonary embolism. And in people with COVID-19, we're seeing a whole cluster of children now who, children at the beginning were considered very low risk group. And now we find a small cluster of children who seem to be developing problems that are a little more than just a cold and a sniffle. So, we know now that this virus produces multi-system problems. We know that it's still a virus that thrives on the gathering of people. So that's why social distancing is important. That's why keeping our mouths covered is important. We now are not so sure that 6 feet is the magic number in terms of distance. There's some very reliable information out there that suggests that perhaps, even though it's not airborne, meaning it doesn't travel on the air current as an aerosol, like when you spray something out of a can, these respiratory droplets that come out of our mouths when we talk and sneeze and cough and things can still get caught up and stay airborne in the air longer than we thought. So now they perhaps could travel longer than 6 feet, maybe 10 feet, maybe 12, which is why some of the modified recommendations include indoor space recommendations versus outdoor space recommendations, as well as the duration of time you spend in those spaces in proximity to other people. So, we know a lot more about the virus, but there's still a lot we don't know. We know that here in Pennsylvania, we've still only tested just over 2% of our population. So out of 12.8 million Pennsylvanians, still 9.8 out of every 10 people you come in contact with will have not been tested in our state. So to say that it's necessarily safe for us to gather when every person to your left, to your right, to your front or back probably hasn't been tested is probably not the smartest thing for us to do. And in church, so now we're talking about an indoor confined space with a lot of high-risk people surrounded by people who haven't been tested. So, green or not, it's probably not the best environment for us to jump right into without some thought. We know that here in Pennsylvania, like in many other states, somewhere between 30 and 50% of the cases are among African Americans. We know that within Allegheny County, that number is a little bit lower. But the point is that, again, in our churches, there are a lot of our folk, many of whom already are in high risk groups, either by age or by virtue of the pre-existing health conditions that they have. And now we're gathering together and not knowing our test result status. We know about the testing disparity. We know that across the country, we tend to be less likely to be tested right now because of the shortage of tests, but we represent a large number of those essential workforce people who are out there working every single day, working multiple shifts, oftentimes with inadequate personal protective equipment, but yet we go home and we can't access testing, but yet we're expected to go back, to work. Many of our brothers and sisters can't call in sick, take sick leave or PTO, and they have to go to work. but they're going to work essentially blind because they don't know their test status and they can't get a test done, although that's starting to change now. So, we also know that we don't have a cure. We have some treatments that seem to be promising, but we don't know enough about those treatments to know how effective they'll be and what the risk versus benefit is. We know that the vaccine is at least 18 to 36 months away. It took almost 3 years to develop an effective vaccine against SARS-1, which was the avian flu. And so there's no reason to think that this is some magical virus. It's actually very hard it's not so hard to replicate in the lab, but the problem is the shape of the virus makes it hard for the immune system to develop a way to kill it. So we are a ways away from a vaccine. We don't know how reliable the testing is. We do know that up to 30% or more, depending on the test that you take, can give you a false negative result, meaning you're told you're negative, but in fact you're not. My father-in-law was one of those people who clearly was COVID infected. His daughter and me were both physicians, clearly knew based on his symptoms that he was COVID positive. He was admitted to the hospital. When he got to he had been tested at an outside location and then went to the hospital and got another test. And while he was in the hospital and recovering, and he since has recovered fully, he was told at the hospital that his test was negative. They then lowered some of their personal protective equipment, kind of isolation procedures, because they had what they felt was a negative test. And on the day of discharge, he got called by the outside facility to tell him that he was COVID positive. So all the while, he was in the hospital being treated and assumed to be negative, when in fact he wasn't. And the tests were both done on the same day, literally an hour apart, maybe 2 hours apart. So there's a lot we don't know. And when I put all that together in my own mind, it makes my decision making a lot easier from the standpoint of I don't know enough to just jump in and want to get back to going to church and doing things as usual. Even though I want to. I mean, I just as much as the next person, I love it to be in the number, in the sanctuary. And I mean, I'm sure can appreciate the fact that there's a difference between hearing broadcasted music and feeling live music. It feels different, it sounds different. Same as hearing the preached word. It's a different vibe when you're surrounded by people, that energy you feel, versus everybody tuning in using technology. So I want to gather too, but I'm just not so sure that just because we're green, just like I'm sure many of the people listening have heard pastors even say, just because it looks good and sounds good doesn't mean it's good for you. I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing for us to jump into opening up our church doors just because somebody changes the color on a chart from yellow to green. So that's kind of what we know. If there are questions or you have questions about other aspects of that, we can talk about the planning, because churches should be planning for what they're going to do and not just responding just to a date on a calendar. And that plan in and of itself should take time and shouldn't be something that you jump into. I mean, we'll take 6 church meetings to coordinate what the church anniversary looks like. But I'm telling you now, there are probably churches out there that just because green means go on June the 5th are planning to have church on June the 8th or June the 7th.
Yes,
and it's ironic because we'll hyper meet to do anything else, but now when it's perhaps the most important decision that a church can make, at least in the last 6 months, many churches are going to be compelled to feel the need to just jump right in and not meet at all. So we can talk about that also.
All right, this is part 1 of my interview with Pastor Chris Conti. We're going to come back and share more with you later on in the day with Motivational Monday.